Hercule Poirot and the Mirror That Showed the Past. Chapter 1. The Mirror in the Blue Room. In the peaceful coastal village of Sainte-Marguerite-sur-Mer, where the olive trees bowed like old men whispering secrets, and the sea murmured in confidential tones, murder was a rarely spoken word. Yet, at the elegant Villa Aureline, perched high on the cliff, a scream pierced the morning breeze with an intensity that only genuine fear can confer. The victim was Madame Léonie Davol, a famous portraitist of the Parisian aristocracy who had been retired for a decade. Her body was found in the Blue Room, one of the guest chambers decorated with excessive Renaissance taste. Her neck had been twisted with unusual violence, but the most disconcerting aspect wasn't the brutality of the crime, but the scene in which she found herself. The woman lay perfectly aligned in front of a full-length antique mirror, her open eyes reflecting her own expression of perpetual horror. The mirror, a 17th-century Flemish piece, was one of the jewels in Léonie's private collection. According to locals, it was reputed to be the mirror that showed the past, a local superstition fueled by centuries of rumour. It was said that anyone who gazed into it could see the unconfessed sins of their own life, or those of others. The local police, headed by Commissioner Lemoine, were overwhelmed by the media attention. The murder of such a prominent figure in such a closed environment was not an everyday occurrence. The domestic staff was visibly shaken. The maid, Solange, could barely speak without tears. The gardener, Monsieur Dupin, maintained a reserved demeanour. But it was Mademoiselle Claire Durand, Léonie's niece and sole heir, who requested the presence of Europe's most famous Belgian detective. Monsieur Poirot, she had written in her letter, my aunt believed that secrets should remain buried, but I believe in the truth, however uncomfortable it may be. If anyone can solve this enigma, it is you. Thus it was that, on a crisp October morning, Hercule Poirot stepped off the train at the Sainte-Marguerite-sur-Mer station, his impeccable pearl-grey suit contrasting sharply with the rural surroundings. He carried a slender ivory walking stick in his hand, and his moustache, more meticulous than ever, looked as if it had been styled with a compass. My friend, he muttered to himself, a murder committed in front of a mirror. What does this tell us? Not about the victim, not about the murderer, but about the soul of the crime. Ah, the little grey cells are already on the move! Poirot was greeted by Claire Durand, a young woman with an intense gaze and demure manner. Upon arriving at the villa, Poirot immediately noticed the tension in the air. It wasn't just fear, but something more. As if the walls themselves had heard too many conversations not meant for human ears. They led him to the Blue Room. There, Poirot stopped. He looked at the mirror, which had not yet been removed by order of the police. He approached slowly, studying not his reflection, but the angle, the dust at the base of the frame, and the position of the furniture. Has anything moved in this room? She asked softly, without taking her eyes off the mirror. Nothing, sir. Everything is just as it was found, replied Commissioner Lemoine, who entered with some apprehension. Poirot nodded, then bent down to pick up something imperceptible to the ordinary eye. A small fragment of paper caught under the skirting board of the sideboard. He tucked it without comment into his linen handkerchief and continued his inspection. On the dressing table she found a sketchbook with recent drawings, portraits, stylized, almost caricature-like faces, all signed with initials LD and 1, in particular caught his eye. A portrait of a woman with a mole above her upper lip, very similar to Claire Durand herself. Poirot closed the notebook delicately, without passing judgment yet. Who was in the house the night of the crime? He finally asked. My aunt, me, Solange, the maid, and Monsieur Etienne Duval, an old family friend who arrived unannounced that day. Claire's voice broke for a moment. The gardener was there too, but he's sleeping in the shed outside. So we have 5 people in total, enough for a private dinner, or a family crime, Poirot said calmly. The commissioner snorted slightly, but Poirot remained unfazed. He turned to the mirror one last time and smiled ironically. It's not the mirror that shows the past, Monsieur Lemoine. It's the people. The mirror only reflects it. And so began Hercule Poirot's investigation, not with a search for fingerprints or weapons, but with a single certainty. The killer did not fear the judgment of the law, but rather the judgment of his own reflection. Chapter 4. 2. Suspects at breakfast. The next morning, an unnatural silence hung over the breakfast table at Villa Aureline. The room, usually bathed in sea light and the lapping of waves in the background, now seemed like a frozen stage set. Only the occasional clink of china and the crackle of bread lightened the atmosphere. Hercule Poirot, impeccable as ever, examined more than he ate. His cup of hot chocolate was untouched. His gaze scanned each face with the precision of a surgeon. Before an incision. There's nothing like the first meal of the day to observe people in their most natural state, he commented softly, to no one in particular. Claire Durand, dressed in ash grey, wore a tense expression. She seemed to have slept badly. Her hair was less carefully tied up than the day before. To her right, Etienne Duval, a thin man in his 60s with a neatly trimmed beard, stirred his coffee with exaggerated concentration. His dark, evasive eyes avoided meeting Poirot's. Mr. Duval, said Poirot, as if continuing an inner thought. You arrived the day before, as I understand it, unannounced. What brought you here? A nostalgic impulse, monsieur. Léonie and I shared many years of friendship, and some disagreements. I felt it was time to make peace, he replied in a deep but calm voice. Poirot nodded gently. And was it received? With pleasure? Etienne hesitated slightly, politely. Léonie was always reserved. Claire intervened coldly. My aunt was selective. Not all of her visitors were welcome, although she rarely said so out loud. Poirot sensed the tension. 2 people, 1 house, an unresolved past. He then turned to the maid Solange, who was serving the toast with trembling hands. Mademoiselle Solange, he said kindly, did you hear anything strange on the night of the crime? The young woman shuddered. No, sir. I left early. But in the morning, before I found the body, I heard a door slam shut in the first floor hallway. What time exactly? Maybe at 7. I was just going downstairs to make the coffee. And who sleeps in that wing? Madame Léonie, Mademoiselle Claire, and Mr. Duvalton Poirot made a mental note. Then he asked permission to visit the kitchen. Accompanied by Solange, he went through the service door. There, the air was different, warmer, redolent of butter, but also tense. "Does the gardener have breakfast here?" asked Poirot. "No, sir. He collects his food in a basket. He doesn't come into the house unless he's called." Poirot nodded. Before leaving, he noticed a tray on the sink. There were remains of food on it. Ham, half a baguette, a broken glass. Who used this tray? Solange frowned. No one. At least not yesterday. That tray has been there for 2 nights. Maybe a guest helped themselves without warning. 2 nights? Curious. Poirot muttered, carefully examining the broken glass. Back in the living room, the detective asked for a walk in the garden. Claire agreed to join him. "Mademoiselle," said Poirot, as they walked through the oleanders, "your aunt, did she keep secrets?" Claire hesitated. "Many. She was a brilliant woman, but also very controlling. She didn't trust anyone completely, not even me." Poirot stopped in front of a moss-covered marble sculpture. "And yet he left everything to you in his will." "Yes," Claire looked down. "Although she told me she hadn't signed the final version yet. She planned to do so this week." Poirot raised his eyebrows. "And do you know if he finally did it?" "No. The notary was coming on Friday." Poirot crossed his arms. An unsigned will, a mirror showing the past, a forgotten broken glass, and 3 people with reasons to want the past buried. The small grey cells worked with fervour to reign. Chapter 3. The Ghost of the Portrait. That same afternoon, Poirot requested to examine the deceased's personal effects, with particular interest in her painting studio. Claire, although visibly uncomfortable, agreed and led him down a corridor lined with faded tapestries to a carved oak double door. Inside, Léonie Davolt's studio revealed an order bordering on obsession. Brushes arranged by size, oil paints organized by hue, and canvases wrapped in white cloths like bodies waiting to be discovered. In one corner, an easel was still set up, with an unfinished portrait still damp to the touch. It was the image of a young woman, not Claire, but another female figure. Her eyes were closed, her face serene as if asleep. Poirot frowned. "Who is this woman?" Claire stepped forward, not looking at the painting. "I don't know. My aunt worked on private portraits that she never exhibited. Sometimes she said they were for anonymous clients, other times that they were studies of faces she'd dreamed up." Poirot lightly touched the edge of the canvas with his glove. Dreaming of a face. How poetic! And yet, sometimes memory disguises itself as a dream. While inspecting the shelves, Poirot discovered a sketchbook with a label on the spine. Mirrors inside. Portraits of people reflected in mirrors. Each drawing had a date and a name, sometimes written in tiny print. Marcel, 1934. Jacques, 1937. Some were crossed out. The last drawing was different. A woman in profile with a scar on her cheek. No name, just the date. October 2nd, 1951, the day before the murder. Poirot carefully closed the folder. Everything in that room spoke of obsession. The repetition of the mirror as a motif, the steadiness of the faces captured just before the unease. A question began to take hold in his mind. Was Léonie painting to remember, or to avoid forgetting? Back in the living room, Poirot found Etienne Duval leafing through an album of old photographs. Noticing the detective, he quickly closed the album. "Do you collect memoirs, Monsieur Duval?" asked Poirot in a neutral tone. "I'm more of a try-to-understand-them kind of person. Memory, it's a fickle creature." Poirot sat opposite him, crossing his legs elegantly. "Would you say that your friendship with Madame Davot was platonic?" Etienne laughed without joy. "I'd say she was complicated. Léonie was intense, charming and cruel in equal measure. She needed me, until she didn't. And you came back to look for her, several times. This visit wasn't the first, but it was the last." Poirot nodded, noting the ambiguity in her tone. Then he handed her a portrait from the studio, one of the many he had discreetly removed, the drawing of the woman with the scar. "Do you recognize this person?" Etienne looked at him for a long moment before shaking his head. "No, but I'd say whoever drew it didn't want to forget it." Later, Poirot walked through the garden in search of the gardener, Monsieur Dupin. He found him standing next to a blooming rose bush, oblivious to the drama surrounding the house. "Monsieur Dupin, would you mind answering a few questions?" "It depends," he replied, continuing to prune. "About what? Whether they are about flowers or about dead people?" Poirot smiled. "About both of them. Tell me, did you see anything the night of the crime?" Dupin stopped. He took out a crumpled handkerchief and wiped his hands before speaking. "I saw a figure enter the studio just after midnight. I thought it was Miss Clare, but the silhouette, it didn't quite match. She was shorter. She was carrying something, a canvas maybe. And he didn't say anything. It's not my custom to intrude, but I thought it was odd. Madame Davot didn't allow visitors in her study." Poirot felt a small spark ignite in his mind. The studio, the figure, the mirror, the unfinished portrait. Who had wanted to sneak in there? And why, that night, while the others were sleeping, Poirot returned to the blue room. He sat in front of the mirror and looked at his reflection. Then he turned off the lamp, letting only the moonlight filter through the window. In the dimness, the mirror seemed alive. It didn't show Poirot, but a shadow, a figure holding something. Poirot sat up slowly. "Yes, my friend," he whispered to himself, "the mirror doesn't lie, but humans do." Chapter 4. Echoes in the glass the following morning brought with it a persistent mist that clung to the windows of Villa Aureline, as if the past refused to release its grip. Poirot, as usual, was already awake, dressed and perfectly groomed before anyone else. He was having breakfast in the greenhouse, surrounded by orchids, when Commissioner Lemoine arrived, frowning, carrying a folder under his arm. "Monsieur Poirot," he began without ceremony, "we have received the preliminary report from the coroner. The estimated time of death is between 11:30 p.m. and midnight. There are no signs of a struggle. A quick death. The neck was broken with a clean movement, as if the murderer knew exactly what he was doing." Poirot nodded slightly, stirring his cup slowly. "And footprints? Nothing useful. Just the victims and the maids. Everything very clean. Too clean, I'd say. Naturally, the killer isn't a common criminal. He's someone who understands the scene as a message. Placing the body in front of the mirror, that was theatrical." The commissioner snorted skeptically. "Or symbolic," although I don't know what kind of symbol a murderer is looking for." Poirot gave a small smile. "The guy who leaves clues for himself, not for others." Later, Poirot asked to speak to Claire alone. The young woman was in the library, leafing through an old copy of Madame Bovary without apparent interest. Seeing him enter, she gently closed the book and stood up. "Have you discovered anything new, Monsieur Poirot?" "Perhaps. But before continuing, I need to understand your aunt better. You said she was a reserved woman. Was she also feared?" Claire thought for a moment. "More than feared. She was respected with caution. She didn't forgive easily. She could hold a grudge for years." "And did he have enemies?" "No declared enemies. But there were people who distanced themselves from her for reasons she never explained. I particularly remember a woman who came to me a few months ago. She wanted to talk to my aunt, but she refused to see her. Afterward, she told me she was a shadow from the past." "Do you remember your name?" "No. He just had a northern accent and a scar on his face." Poirot sat up with interest. The scar, like in the portrait. Was it possible that this woman had returned? And if she hadn't, why did Léonie draw her just before she died? After the conversation, Poirot searched the house for Solange. He found her folding sheets in the laundry room. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, "I need you to tell me something with absolute honesty. Did your lady expect any visitors on the night of the crime?" Solange put the sheet aside, lowering her voice almost to a whisper. "It wasn't planned. But I saw something. I saw Madame write a letter that afternoon. She put it in a blue envelope with the name Dr. Arnaud, and she asked me not to post it until the next day. Where is that letter now? She disappeared. I went looking for her the next morning, but she wasn't at the desk anymore." Poirot narrowed his eyes. An unmailed letter, an unknown name, a perhaps secret rendezvous. Later, inspecting Léonie's desk, he found the inkstand clean and the quill pens neatly lined up. Everything was in order, except for one blank sheet of paper, very lightly marked by writing pressure. Poirot took out a soft pencil and rubbed it over the sheet, barely revealing the lines traced by a firm hand. "Truth demands a mirror. Not everyone can bear to look into it." Poirot stood very still. It was a note, or a confession. But from whom? She left the office. She briefly crossed paths with Etienne Duval, who seemed restless. His steps were erratic, his fingers stained with black ink. "Have you been writing, Monsieur Duval?" "A memoir. For myself. A way to organize memories," she replied without looking him in the eye. Poirot bowed slightly. "Oh, memories, as capricious as mirrors. Sometimes they show us what we want to see, not what was." As Duval walked away, Poirot stared at his figure, just another shadow among the silent echoes of the house. And at that moment, he knew that the mirror of the Blue Room, it did not only show the past. He showed guilt. Chapter 5. The Trace of a Lie. Midday brought a strange calm to Villa Aureline, as if the air itself had stopped, afraid to stir the secrets hidden within its walls. Poirot, after a solitary stroll among the lemon trees in the garden, requested a meeting with all the house's inhabitants. It was not yet time for a final confrontation, but it was time to observe, compare, and provoke. He gathered them in the drawing-room, where the tapestries and family portraits seemed to stare at them from centuries away. Claire, Etienne, Solange, and the gardener Dupin sat down with varying degrees of discomfort. Poirot remained standing by the large fireplace. "Dear sirs and madam," he began politely, "I appreciate your time. I'd like to discuss a lost letter." A faint flicker crossed Claire's face. Etienne visibly tensed. Solange looked down. Madame Davot wrote a letter on the day of her death. It was addressed to a certain Dr. Arnaud. Do any of you know that name? The silence thickened. Then Etienne cleared his throat. "I met him many years ago. He was a psychologist. Léonie came to him after a difficult episode. He didn't talk much about it. And you, Mademoiselle Durand?" "I heard it mentioned once, during an argument. My aunt said the doctor had made a mistake that ruined a life." "And what life was that?" Claire hesitated. Poirot noticed her breathing slightly increase. "I don't know. I assumed she was talking about herself." Poirot approached calmly. "Are you sure?" Claire looked at him, and for a moment her eyes betrayed a doubt she hadn't wanted to admit. Poirot turned to Solange. "Do you remember what the letter was addressed to? Just the name, or was there an address?" "It just said, to Dr. Arnaud, confidential." Poirot nodded. "Interesting. A letter that disappears. A recipient who hasn't been informed. Don't you find that curious?" Etienne crossed his arms. "What are you trying to imply?" "Nothing, monsieur. I'm just observing. Just as I noticed that the broken glass that appeared in the kitchen belongs to an antique Venetian crystal set. The same one displayed in the dining-room glass cabinet. Curious, since Madame Davot didn't allow its regular use." Claire frowned. "What do you suggest with that? That someone poured themselves a drink without permission, and that broken glass was hidden without a word? Why, it could have been an accident," Solange murmured. Poirot turned to her. "Maybe, but it could also have contained something that the killer didn't want to be discovered." The gardener Dupin, who had remained silent until then, spoke in a deep voice. "I'm no detective, sir, but the secrets in this house are old, and some aren't yours, but inherited." Poirot looked at him carefully. "What do you mean?" "Madame Davot bought this house 20 years ago, but it was previously owned by a family called the Lestranges. It was said that one of the daughters went mad, that she spoke to mirrors. It was never explained. What happened to her?" Claire sat up in surprise. "My aunt never mentioned any of that. Maybe because I didn't want you to know." Poirot thanked everyone and let them go, knowing that he had sown unrest where there had been silence. Later, he examined the mirror frame of the blue room. He noticed a slight scuff on the right edge, as if something had been placed against it, perhaps a paper or a photograph, held briefly and then removed. What had the killer wanted to show? Or to whom? That night, Poirot remained alone in the room. He lit a single candle and placed it in front of the mirror. He stared at his reflection, just as the victim had done. "You are hiding something," he whispered, "but not for much longer." Behind him, a soft creaking sound. Poirot turned slightly. A figure paused in the doorway. Etienne Duval. "Can't you sleep, Monsieur Duval?" asked Poirot without turning around. It's not the house, it's what it holds, Etienne replied wearily. Sometimes I think Léonie didn't die for what she knew, but for what she didn't want to reveal. Poirot watched him in the reflection with a sharp look. And you knew it? Etienne looked down. I knew she was hiding something important, something that was tormenting her. Poirot stood up slowly. And perhaps what she was hiding is precisely what killed her. Chapter 6. The Silence of the Incomplete Portrait. The next morning, Poirot requested access to Léonie Devoe's personal files. Claire, though still visibly shaken by the previous day's insinuations, accepted with some resignation. She led the detective to a room adjoining the study, a sort of private office that her aunt had kept closed, even to her, the key. He said he had found between the folds of an old leather diary. It was a small room, lined with leather-bound books, folders categorized with handwritten labels, and a collection of annual diaries spanning nearly 2 decades. The dust on the spines indicated that some hadn't been touched for years. Poirot began to go through the pages methodically, page by page. He soon found an entry from 1948 that made him stop. Dr. Arnaud, appointment cancelled, too much risk, the girl shouldn't know anything. Poirot frowned. The girl? Did he mean Claire, or someone else? The reference was cryptic, but it suggested a deliberate decision to bury an uncomfortable past. Can I take these diaries? Asked Poirot. Claire hesitated. If you think they can help, all truth is between the lines, mademoiselle. Back in his room, Poirot spent the rest of the day reviewing his notes, looking for patterns. He discovered frequent mentions of the name C in more recent years, but there was also one name that appeared more regularly in earlier decades. Marianne. No last name. No context, just M or Marianne, accompanied by disturbing phrases. Too similar, will not forgive. The portrait must remain hidden. Poirot then did something unexpected. He asked to see the basement. Claire raised an eyebrow. The basement? Yes. Every artist hides their mistakes where no one is looking. Accompanied by Dupin, they descended a narrow stone staircase. The air was damp, thick with the scent of dried oil paint and wood. There, among covered canvases and broken easels, Poirot found what he was looking for. A portrait covered with a thick sheet, hidden behind a row of empty stretcher bars. With a solemn gesture, he removed the cloth. It was the portrait of a young woman, with light eyes, wavy hair, and a vertical scar on her left cheek. Claire watched him in horror. That's the woman in the drawing. Who is she? Poirot approached the bottom edge of the canvas. Beneath the signature, something had been scraped away, carefully erased. But in the grazing light, Poirot managed to make out a stroke, an M. Marianne, he murmured. Who was she? I don't know yet, but I do know this. Her face appears in recent drawings, and in older ones too, which tells me she wasn't a passing memory, but a constant, an important figure, an obsession perhaps. Claire trembled slightly. Do you think he had anything to do with my aunt's death? Poirot covered the painting again with the sheet. In crimes, mademoiselle, the motive is always twofold. What one wants to protect and what one wants to hide. Back in the drawing room, Poirot asked Solange to show him the deceased's jewels. It was customary, he explained, to check if anything had been stolen. The maid brought him a red velvet box, still locked with its original key. Inside, everything was in its place. Pearl necklaces, brooches, sapphire earrings, everything except a cameo. There was one missing, Solange said, noticing it. An antique locket. Madame rarely wore it. She said it was from another life. And do you remember what it was like? Oval. It had a picture inside, but he never let us see it. Poirot felt the pieces of the puzzle begin to slide into place. A missing cameo, a hidden portrait, a forgotten woman, and a letter that someone never wanted to reach its recipient. That evening, Poirot returned to the Blue Room, this time with a flashlight. He examined the mirror frame more closely. Finally, he found a thin, almost imperceptible slit, a hidden compartment. He opened it carefully. Inside, he found an old black-and-white photograph. It was the same woman in the portrait, Marianne. And beside her, a little girl, with a restless look behind in shaky handwriting. To my daughter, when one day she wants to remember who her mother was. Poirot slowly closed his eyes. My God, all this time, the story was not just about a murder. It was a legacy of silence. Chapter 7. The Forgotten Mother. The discovery of the photograph brought about a silent but profound shift in Poirot's heart. It wasn't just an old image. It was a declaration of identity, hidden for decades out of fear, shame, or guilt. And now, the mirror, a symbol of the reflection of truths, had fulfilled its ultimate purpose. To show what he had refused to see for years. That same morning, Poirot requested a private meeting with Claire Durand. He summoned her to the library, where the portrait of Léonie Davaux presided over the room with a stern expression. Claire arrived punctually. She was wearing a pale linen dress, and her hair was tied more neatly than usual. Her expression was a mixture of confusion, tension, and fear. Poirot offered him a seat. Then he took the photograph he had found behind the mirror from his inside jacket pocket. Mademoiselle, do you recognize these people? Claire took the photo with hesitant hands. She looked at it closely. For a moment, her lips parted, but no words came out. Finally, she looked up. It's me, when I was a child. Poirot nodded delicately. And the woman at his side? Claire frowned, as if trying to rescue a memory drowned in the fog. I don't know. He looks like me, but I don't know who he is. It's your mother, Mademoiselle. Claire froze. My mother died giving birth to me. That's what my aunt always told me. No, his mother lived. Her name was Marianne Lestrange. The name seemed to hit her physically. Claire placed a hand on her chest, as if to steady her breathing. But then Poirot leaned forward slightly. Léonie Davaux wasn't her mother. She was her aunt, yes, but she was also her protector. When her mother was institutionalized, not for insanity, but due to a profound emotional crisis following a series of cruel family decisions, Léonie took custody of her and raised her as her own. The surname Durand was an invention, a way to break with the past, to bury the shame that she believed weighed on the family. Claire remained motionless, the photograph in her lap, the portrait of her aunt watching her from the wall. So, it was all a lie. No, Poirot corrected her tenderly. It was a desperate choice, perhaps misguided, but not devoid of affection. Claire stood up abruptly, walking to the window. The view of the sea suddenly seemed alien. She spoke without looking at the detective. "Why did you hide it from me? Why didn't you tell me when I was older?" Poirot watched her silently for a moment before answering. "Because the truth, mademoiselle, is a mirror. A broken one can hurt whoever looks into it, and perhaps Madame Davot, in her last days, feared that you would see something you couldn't forgive." There was a long silence. Finally, Claire turned around. "Do you think this story has anything to do with his death?" "I'm convinced of that, but not yet entirely sure how. The recent appearance of a drawing of your mother's in the study indicates that Madame Davot was reliving that past, that a wound had been reopened, and it's quite possible that someone else knew it." "Someone like Etienne Duval?" Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Interesting that you mention that. Why?" "Because I heard him arguing with my aunt the night before she died. They were in the study. I was passing by in the hall, and I heard his raised voice. He was mentioning betrayal." Poirot nodded slowly. "Thanks for telling me. It's just another piece. A very revealing one." When Claire left, Poirot was left alone in the library. He took out the photograph again. Marianne's face, serene, with an unmistakable sadness. A woman, rejected by her family, separated from her daughter, converted into a secret. Had she reclaimed what was taken from her? That thought led him back to the portrait hidden in the basement. Marianne with her crudely drawn scar. A portrait painted in rage, not love. Why would Léonie keep such a picture? Was it an act of remorse or a warning? That evening, Poirot walked around the villa once more. He stopped at the blue room, now devoid of its ghostly air. He looked at the mirror, which no longer concealed anything. "There is nothing left but the truth," he murmured, and he knew he was very close. Chapter 8. The weight of memories. The atmosphere at Villa Aureline seemed to have become even denser since the revelation of Claire's true identity. The silence that permeated the corridors was different. No longer the silence of bewilderment, but that of expectation. A truth had come to light, but it was still possible to sense that something else, something dark and definitive, lurked beneath the surface. Poirot spent a good part of the morning writing in his personal notebook. He didn't take notes randomly, but rather formulated hypotheses. Each name was followed by a key word. Claire, Sangre, Léonie, silence, Marianne, exile, Duval, betrayal. That puzzle was not only chronological, but emotional. It was in this state of meditation that he received an unexpected visit. Monsieur Dupin, the gardener. "I need to tell you something, Monsieur Poirot," the man said, hat in hand, his voice tense. "But not here, in the greenhouse, where no one can hear us." Poirot agreed without comment. Once inside the greenhouse, surrounded by the murmur of the fountains and the scent of damp jasmine, Dupin made up his mind. "I've worked here since before Madame Davot bought the villa. I saw things. I heard things I've kept quiet about for years. And now I realize that maybe I should have spoken up sooner." Poirot remained silent, letting the confession flow. When Madame arrived, she brought a little girl. She said she was an orphan. But a year later, a woman came looking for her. A woman with a scar and eyes as clear as ice. She screamed, she begged, she wanted to take the girl. Madame confronted her like a beast. She drove her away. That night, the woman left over the cliffs. No one saw her again. We thought she had died. Poirot narrowed his eyes. And you believe that woman was Marianne Lestrange? I knew it when I saw the portrait, that face. You won't forget it. And you told the police? Dupin shook his head. What was I going to say? Nobody wanted scandals, and Madame had power, money. I was just a gardener. Poirot looked at him closely. And now, why do you say that? Because Madame's death wasn't about money. It was about what happened that day. Because someone, maybe even Claire, figured out it was all a lie. Poirot thanked him for his testimony and let him go. Then he went directly to the music room, where Etienne Duval was leafing through dusty scores. The man's face had a sallow tinge today, his beard overgrown and his eyes hollow. "We need to talk, Monsieur Duval," said Poirot firmly. "About what?" "About treason. You said that word the night before Madame Davaux died. Claire heard you. What did you mean?" Etienne pressed his lips together. "I have nothing to hide. On the contrary, you have too much. And I'll tell you, you were Marianne Lestrange's lover. Am I wrong?" Duval froze. Poirot continued relentlessly. "You loved her. But when her family disowned her and institutionalized her, you did nothing. And when she came back for her daughter, you stayed away. It was that cowardice that haunted you all these years, right? That's why you came back now. Because you knew Léonie was going to reveal the truth. And that would make you look like the man who failed to protect either mother or daughter." Duval looked down. "I didn't kill her. Maybe not, but their silences carried weight. And someone else turned them into action." Poirot withdrew without another word. His mind was boiling. He knew the circle was narrowing, that the crime wasn't passionate or impulsive, but deeply psychological. It wasn't due to inheritance or jealousy. It was about identity, about truth. That night, Poirot returned to his room and organized his thoughts. The pieces were now clear. All that remained was to summon everyone. It was time for the final meeting. Chapter 9. The Meeting in the Blue Room. The next morning, Hercule Poirot gathered all the inhabitants of Villa Aureline in the Blue Room. He did so in a firm but undramatic voice. It wasn't a theatrical scene. It was a dissection. There, under the pale light of the half-open curtains, and in front of the mirror that had witnessed a crime, Claire, Etienne, Solange, and Monsieur Dupin lined up. The room had been cleared, save for a single chair placed in front of the mirror. Poirot didn't sit down. He walked slowly, as if the measured rhythm of his steps helped sort out the fragments of truth. "My friends, this is a house of secrets, and secrets, like corpses, have a nasty habit of coming to the surface." He paused. No one was speaking. Madame Léonie Davaux was murdered. Not for greed, not for inheritance, not even for revenge in its simplest form. She was murdered for what she symbolized, for being the guardian of a lie, and for finally choosing to tell the truth. He turned to Claire. Mademoiselle Durand, or more correctly, Mademoiselle Lestrange, you are Marianne's daughter. Your mother didn't die. She was rejected by her family, institutionalized, stripped of her daughter. Your aunt raised you and transformed your past, but she didn't destroy the traces. Not completely. Claire pressed her lips together, her eyes fixed on the ground. Someone discovered that truth, Poirot continued. Someone who couldn't allow it to be revealed. Not because of the damage to his reputation, but because of the horror of having to face his role in it. He turned slowly and stopped in front of Etienne Duval. You, Monsieur Duval, were not the murderer, but your sins of omission were seeds that blossomed into tragedy. You loved Marianne, but you didn't fight for her, not for her or for your daughter. Your return here now was to assuage your guilt. Too late. Etienne stood motionless, his face ashen. Poirot turned to Solange. Mademoiselle Solange, you witnessed many things. The missing letter, the missing locket, but it wasn't you who took Madame's life. Your loyalty was to the lady, even if you didn't fully understand it. Solange nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Poirot took a step further and stood next to the mirror. The murderer, mes amis, isn't one with hatred, but with fear. Fear of losing the only place he recognized as his own. Fear of discovering his life was built on a stolen foundation. The crime was silent, calculated, without struggle, without passion, just decision. He turned slowly to Claire. Mademoiselle, the mirror doesn't show the past. It shows what one refuses to see. You discovered the truth, didn't you? The portrait, the photograph, the name Lestrange. You learned that everything you believed about yourself was a construct. That your mother wasn't an anonymous martyr, but a living, rejected woman. And you felt that everything, your identity, your childhood, even your love for your aunt, was false. Claire looked up. Her face was stony, but her voice trembled. I didn't do it out of anger. Poirot nodded without judgment. No, it was out of desperation. A confrontation, an argument, perhaps an impulsive gesture that ended badly. But then, the scene was manipulated, the body placed in front of the mirror, like a judgment, like a symbol. I didn't want to kill her, Claire said, her voice breaking now. I wanted her to tell me why, that's all. But she didn't apologize. Never. She just looked at me, like I should be grateful. There was a deathly silence. I pushed her. She fell against the edge of the bed. Her neck. She sobbed. I froze. Afterward, I just knew I had to do something. Poirot approached and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. You're not a monster. But it wasn't an accident either. It was an inevitable breakup. A truth that wasn't revealed in time. Etienne, pale, murmured, What will happen now? That will be for justice to decide, Poirot replied. But I have done my part. I have put the pieces together, and I have restored the image to its true reflection. Claire sank into the chair in front of the mirror. For the first time she looked into it without lowering her gaze. And what she saw there, perhaps, was something more terrifying than the truth. It was herself. Chapter 10. Order Restored. Hours after the confession, the local police, alerted by Poirot, discreetly arrived at Villa Aurélane. Claire Durand, or Claire Lestrange, as she was now known, offered no resistance. She surrendered without a word, her gaze vacant, as if she no longer quite belonged to the present. She was escorted from the house as the sky began to darken, covering the cliffs in a veil of shadows that seemed appropriate for the tragedy that had just unravelled. Commissioner Lemoine, visibly shocked by the decision, shook Poirot's hand with a mixture of respect and bewilderment. "I never would have imagined that she—" he began. Poirot raised a finger. Polite, but firm. "No, sir, it's never just about the act. Crime is the final manifestation of an invisible conflict. If you look only at the crime scene, you'll see nothing but death. But if you look at the souls, you'll find the root. And the root of this," Poirot sighed, looking into the mirror. "Blue room, now covered by a white cloth. Identity, abandonment, and a tragic but understandable human need to know who we are and why we were denied." When silence returned to the house, Poirot asked for one last visit to Léonie Davaux's studio. He entered alone. The unfinished portrait was still there, still bearing the moist traces of an interrupted truth. Marianne, her eyes closed, as if she had never had the right to open them. Poirot, delicately, removed the canvas and covered it. Then he went to a small metal box he had seen days before, locked. He forced it open with a precision tool from his personal case. Inside, he found a gold chain with an oval locket. He opened it. Inside, 2 miniature portraits, Marianne and little Claire, and between them a yellowed note with just 5 words. "Forgive me. I always loved you." Poirot closed the locket again and held it in the palm of his hand for a long moment. Then he placed it on the desk next to the covered portrait, as if leaving 2 witnesses to a broken history. A silent reconciliation, though too late. The next day Poirot prepared for his departure. Monsieur Dupin helped him with his luggage. Solange, still shaken, offered him a small box of macarons as a gesture of thanks. Etienne Duval didn't appear to say goodbye. He had reportedly left early for the north, in pursuit of unfinished business. At the Sainte-Marguerite-sur-Mer train station, as the train released steam and the whistle announced its departure, Poirot took one last look at the profile of the cliff-top villa. There, beneath its elegant facade, lay the ruins of a carefully constructed lie. He boarded his private carriage and settled into the seat, with his leather suitcase at his side and a copy of The Psychology of Memory on her lap. Hastings, to whom she had written a few days earlier, had yet to respond. Perhaps it was better that way, she thought. Not all stories need to be told in every detail. Some should remain in memory, as a warning. As the train began to move forward, Poirot took out his notebook and wrote his last entry for the case. Truth, like a mirror, can be broken. But even in the scattered fragments, the reflection remains. Justice is not always punishment. Sometimes it is simply restoring the order that was disturbed. He closed the notebook with a serene gesture. Then, with his moustache perfectly in place and his heart slightly heavier than usual, he let himself be carried along by the rocking of the train. And so, Hercule Poirot left behind the mirror that showed the past. Chapter 11. The Commentary of silence. The train taking Poirot away from Sainte-Marguerite-sur-Mer moved with the calm cadence of a story that has been told to the end. However, for the famous detective, the closure of a case didn't mean forgetting it. His mind, meticulous as his moustache, reviewed the details again and again, not to doubt its conclusion, but to understand its implications. Léonie Davol's death hadn't been a crime of passion, but the delayed outcome of a long-delayed truth. And Claire, not a killer by vocation, but a victim of inherited silence. As the coastal landscape gave way to golden fields, Poirot leafed through his notebook thoughtfully. His gaze fell on an unfinished entry. Revealed truth doesn't always redeem. Sometimes it hurts more than the lie that preceded it. He sighed. It was a bitter truth. At the next stop, a young local journalist boarded the carriage, notebook in hand. He had been informed by the station master that Poirot was travelling on that train. He approached cautiously. "Monsieur Poirot, my name is Julien Morel. I am writing to the Courier of Normandy. Could I ask you a few questions about the case?" Poirot looked at him politely, but without enthusiasm. "My young friend, if it's a headline you're after, I'm afraid this story won't provide the kind of drama that fuels the presses. There's no multi-million-dollar inheritance at stake, no secret lovers, just a young woman raised on a lie, and a woman who chose protection over the truth." Julien looked disappointed for a moment. "But don't you think people should know that the whole truth should be told?" Poirot clasped his hands on his walking stick. The whole truth, or a clean version of the truth without its jagged edges? Julien did not respond. Poirot looked down at the young man's notebook. "Write this down, if you like. Madame Davaux was a victim of the past, her niece of silence, and the real crime wasn't the push in the dark, but the abandonment of a woman named Marianne, whom everyone forgot except her reflection." The journalist nodded silently. Then he retreated to the other end of the car, visibly more thoughtful than when he arrived. The train continued moving. The stations passed like closed chapters. Poirot, for his part, allowed himself a moment of introspection. He remembered Marianne, the scar, the soft gaze, the face repeated again and again in the portraits, as if Léonie had tried to exorcise her guilt with a paintbrush. What if Marianne was still alive? The idea wasn't far-fetched. No one had ever confirmed her death, only her disappearance. Perhaps she still existed in some forgotten corner of the coast, oblivious to the drama her absence had caused. Or perhaps the mirror had been her symbolic. Tombant Poirot opened the notebook again and wrote a final line. "Sometimes it's not death that weighs on us, but the living who continue without understanding it." The conductor's voice announced our arrival in Paris. Poirot packed his things neatly and stood up. As he stepped off the train, the city greeted him with its usual mix of noise, hurried footsteps and the aroma of coffee. But for Poirot, it all seemed distant. The crime was solved, yes, but not the story. This one would remain open, like all those where the motive lies not in what is stolen, but in what one fears to remember. And with that thought, he disappeared into the crowd, his silhouette straight as ever, but with a slightly slower gait than usual. Chapter 12. The Reflection That Remains. A week after the events at Villa Aureline, a letter arrived at Hercule Poirot's London residence. The envelope was discreet, with no return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper written in elegant handwriting. "Mr. Poirot, I don't expect your forgiveness, or the world's. I just wanted to thank you for showing me the full mirror. Sometimes you need to see the full horror to understand what you're capable of. They told me justice would be lenient. B. Maybe because I was honest. Maybe because I was humane. My mother's name was Marianne. Now I know. Thank you for giving her back to me, even though it was late. Claire." Poirot read the letter silently. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in a box containing a few other things: a photograph, a dried orchid petal, and a locket that had been returned to him by the police. No one ever claimed it. Marianne's cameo. He stood up from his desk and walked to the window. Outside, the streets of London bustled with their usual activity. Yet for him, each case closed a small circle, not just of deduction, but of understanding. Human nature. The case of Léonie Davaux had been a tangle of mirrors, distorted reflections of love, of identity, of motherhood. A woman who raised her niece as a daughter, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Another woman vanished into the shadows, forgotten by those who should have defended her. And a young woman who, upon discovering her true reflection, knew nothing but to react with despair. In his mind, Poirot reviewed the clues one last time. The hidden portrait, the missing medallion, the locked study, the unsent letter, the broken cup, the figure seen by the gardener. The past that no one wanted to remember. Everything fit together. But more than the physical evidence, it was her behaviour that had led him to the truth. Claire's body language, her emotional restraint, her difficulty looking in the mirror. The mirror didn't show the past, no. It showed guilt. And guilt, Poirot thought, always reveals itself in the details. That night, he dined alone, as usual. But when he removed his plate, he found he had inadvertently arranged his fork, knife, and napkin in a perfect cross on the tablecloth. He stopped, smiled slightly, and murmured, "Order. Always order, even when the world around us is falling apart." Before going to sleep, he took out his leather notebook and wrote his last thoughts on the case. At the heart of the crime, there was no hatred, no greed, only the silent cry of a daughter who never knew she was one. In that ignorance, a tragedy germinated. But even among the remains of the lie, love hid, twisted, yes, but authentic. He closed the notebook, arranged his moustache with mathematical precision, and turned off the lamp. Thus it ended for Hercule Poirot, the case of the mirror that showed the past. But for those left behind, the real challenge was living with the reflection that remained.